Welcome to another gripping episode of True Crime Case Files, where we uncover the most chilling and complex crimes that have shocked communities. Today's episode takes us to a quiet, unassuming high school teacher who finds himself entangled in a web of secrecy, obsession, and ultimately, murder. This is the story of how a secret gay love affair with a student turned deadly. Carter Dressler, 29, was a well-respected high school history teacher at Richmond High School, located in the bustling heart of Richmond, Virginia. Its students knew him as Mr. Dressler, a man who always wore neatly pressed suits, usually with a patterned tie that added a touch of personality to his otherwise serious demeanor. Carter was known for his quiet, reserved nature. He wasn't the type to speak out of turn or draw attention to himself, but those who knew him best described him as kind and thoughtful. Carter had a deep love for history, particularly American history, and he made it his mission to instill that passion in his students. He often invited students to his modest one-bedroom house for overnight study sessions that went above and beyond the regular school curriculum, much to the concern of his neighbors that he was engaged in inappropriate relationships with his students. Carter's garden was his pride and joy, filled with a variety of rare and exotic plants, many of which he had cultivated over the years. Among them was the monkshood, a strikingly beautiful but deadly plant known for its deep purple flowers. Carter took great care of his garden, often spending hours each day tending to the plants. He was particularly proud of the monkshood, which he had grown from seeds he ordered from a specialized nursery. Despite the rumors that swirled around his relationships with the students, Carter was well liked by both students and colleagues. His lessons were engaging, and he had a way of making history come alive, often incorporating current events into his teaching. In the days leading up to his death, Carter's behavior was much the same as usual. He continued to teach his classes, tend to his garden, and spend his evenings quietly reading or watching PBS NewsHour. However, there were hints of tension in his personal life that not everyone noticed. Some of his neighbors had seen him walking late at night with one of his students, Dan White, but they dismissed it as another of his mentoring sessions. No one could have imagined that just days later, Carter would be dead, the victim of a sinister plot that would shock the community. On the evening of July 15, 2017, Richmond, Virginia, was enjoying a typical summer night, with the sun setting late and temperatures hovering around 80 degrees. The neighborhood where Carter Dressler lived was quiet, with most residents winding down after a long, hot day. Around 7:30 p.m., Lisa Hall, Carter's next-door neighbor, decided to check on him. Lisa was a single mother in her late 30s, known for being outspoken and a bit nosy, but she genuinely cared about her neighbors, especially Carter, whom she considered a close friend. Lisa had noticed that Carter hadn't been out in his garden all day, which was unusual. He was usually outside by early morning, tending to his plants, especially on weekends. As she walked across her lawn, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She knocked on Carter's front door, but there was no answer. The house seemed eerily still. Concerned, Lisa decided to check the backyard, where Carter often spent his evenings reading or working in the garden. As she rounded the corner of the house, she saw Carter sitting on his favorite porch chair, a book in his lap, and a cup of tea on the small table beside him. But something was off. Carter wasn't moving. His head was slumped forward, and the book he loved so much had fallen from his hands. Lisa's heart raced as she approached him, calling his name. When he didn't respond, she reached out to shake his shoulder, only to be met with the cold, stiff feeling of his skin. Panic set in, and she quickly realized that something was terribly wrong. Lisa ran back to her house and called 911, her voice shaking as she tried to explain the situation. The dispatcher instructed her to stay calm and wait for the authorities to arrive. Lisa stood on her porch, eyes fixed on Carter's lifeless body, as she waited for the police. She couldn't believe what was happening. Just the day before, she had seen Carter in his garden, smiling and waving as she drove past. Now he was dead, and she was the one who had found him. The first officers arrived within minutes, quickly securing the scene and confirming Lisa's worst fears. Carter Dressler was dead. The once peaceful evening had turned into a nightmare, and the quiet neighborhood was soon filled with the flashing lights of police cars and the murmurs of concerned neighbors. The police arrived at Carter Dressler's home shortly after Lisa Hall's frantic 911 call on July 15, 2017. The first officers on the scene were Richmond police detectives Laura Colley and Tom Keller. Colley, a seasoned investigator in her mid-40s, was known for her sharp intuition and meticulous attention to detail. Keller, slightly younger and more methodical, was her trusted partner. Both detectives had handled numerous cases in Richmond, but something about this one felt different from the moment they stepped onto the property. As they approached the back porch where Carter's body was found, Colley immediately noticed the eerie stillness of the scene. The garden, usually vibrant and full of life, seemed almost haunting in the fading evening light. The air was thick with the scent of flowers, but the sweet aroma did little to mask the unsettling presence of death. Carter's body sat unnaturally still in his chair, his head slumped forward and his eyes closed as if he had simply fallen asleep while reading. The detectives carefully surveyed the area, making note of the details. The book in Carter's lap was a history text, one of his favorites, open to a chapter about the American Revolution. Beside him on the small table was a cup of tea, now cold. Colley observed the tea more closely, noting the faint remnants of a powdery substance at the bottom of the cup. It was an immediate red flag, suggesting that something had been added to the tea. The crime scene itself was surprisingly tidy, with no signs of a struggle. There was no blood, no overturned furniture, nothing that indicated a violent altercation. This led the detectives to suspect that Carter's death might not have been an accident. Colley and Keller were aware of Carter's reputation as a reserved but well-liked teacher, making it hard to believe that anyone would want to harm him. But they also knew that the quietest lives often hid the darkest secrets. The detectives called in the forensic team, who quickly began their work, dusting for fingerprints and collecting samples. They took the teacup and its contents as evidence, as well as a few leaves from the monkshood plant in the garden, which Colley had identified as potentially poisonous. The forensic team also examined Carter's body, noting the signs of poisoning: pale skin, a bluish tint to the lips, and the characteristic rigidity of a body that had been dead for several hours. As the investigation continued into the night, Colley and Keller began piecing together what had happened. The lack of visible wounds and the presence of the poisonous plant led them to believe that Carter's death was the result of foul play, likely involving someone who knew him well enough to plan the murder carefully. With this in mind, the detectives prepared to question the people closest to Carter, starting with his neighbors and the students who frequently visited his home. The first person the police questioned in connection with Carter Dressler's death was Dan White, an 18-year-old student at Richmond High School. Dan was known for his charm and intelligence, often dazzling teachers and classmates with his sharp wit. He was a star on the school's debate team, frequently leading them to victory in competitions across Virginia. Despite his success, those close to him knew Dan had a darker side. He was highly possessive, especially in his sexual relationships, where rumors swirled he was interested in violent sex, and could be obsessive to the point of controlling. Detectives Laura Colley and Tom Keller brought Dan in for questioning the morning after Carter's body was discovered. They met him in a small, windowless interrogation room at the Richmond Police Department. Dan arrived looking calm, almost indifferent, wearing a neatly pressed polo shirt and jeans. His demeanor was relaxed, as if he had nothing to hide. Colley started the interrogation by asking Dan about his relationship with Carter. Dan admitted they were close, describing Carter as a mentor who had helped him through many difficult times. He said they often spent time together outside of school, discussing history and preparing for upcoming debate competitions. Dan spoke fondly of Carter, painting a picture of a supportive, almost fatherly figure in his life. But as the questioning continued, Colley shifted the focus to Dan's whereabouts on the night of Carter's death. Dan claimed he had been home all evening, working on a new debate strategy for an upcoming tournament. He said he hadn't seen Carter for a few days and was shocked to hear about his death. However, Colley noticed a slight change in his demeanor when she asked about Carter's other students, particularly those who also visited his one-bedroom home for overnight study sessions. Dan's answers became more clipped, and his previously relaxed posture grew tense. The detectives pressed Dan on his feelings toward Carter, subtly hinting at the possibility of jealousy. Dan's responses became more defensive, and at one point he raised his voice, insisting he had nothing to do with Carter's death. Keller, observing Dan's body language, noted the sudden shift from calm to agitated, a sign that Dan might be hiding something. When asked directly if he had ever been jealous of Carter's close relationships with other students, Dan hesitated before giving a firm no. But the hesitation didn't go unnoticed. Colley and Keller exchanged a glance, realizing they had touched a nerve. Despite his outward calm, Dan's reaction suggested there might be more to his relationship with Carter than he was willing to admit. As the interrogation ended, Dan maintained his innocence, but the detectives left the room with more questions than answers. They knew Dan's charm and intelligence made him a skilled manipulator, and his connection to Carter was deeper and more complex than he was letting on. The possibility that Dan's obsession with Carter had turned deadly couldn't be ignored. Next, the police turned their attention to Lisa Hall, Carter Dressler's 38-year-old neighbor. Lisa was known in the Richmond neighborhood for her outspoken nature and fiery temper. She lived alone with her teenage daughter, Corona, and had earned a reputation as someone who was always in other people's business. Despite this, Lisa had a soft spot for Carter. They had been close friends for years, often chatting over the fence that separated their yards. She admired Carter's dedication to teaching and his love for gardening, but she had long been suspicious of his relationships with male students. Detectives Laura Colley and Tom Keller invited Lisa to the station for questioning. When she arrived, Lisa looked nervous but composed, wearing a simple blouse and jeans. Colley began by asking Lisa about her friendship with Carter. Lisa spoke warmly about him, mentioning how they often exchanged gardening tips and talked about the latest news from the Richmond Times-Dispatch. However, when the conversation shifted to Carter's relationships with his students, Lisa's tone changed. She admitted that she had been worried about Carter's behavior, especially his habit of inviting students to a small one-bedroom home for overnight stays. Lisa confessed that she had confronted Carter about his creepy relationships with the students several times. She believed he was seeking their approval in unhealthy ways, possibly by offering them sex, though she stopped short of accusing him of assaulting them. Lisa's concern was that Carter might be emotionally manipulating the boys for the love that he desperately needed, and she had repeatedly urged him to stop. Despite her warnings, Carter continued his creepy relationships with his students, and Lisa's frustration grew. When Colley asked Lisa where she was on the night of Carter's death, Lisa stated that she had been home with her daughter, watching a rerun of NCIS New Orleans. She mentioned that she had seen Carter earlier in the day, but their interaction was brief. She didn't notice anything unusual, but admitted that she had felt uneasy for weeks, sensing that something was wrong between Carter and Dan White, one of the students he was closest to. As the questioning continued, Lisa's emotions bubbled to the surface. She became visibly upset, tears welling in her eyes as she spoke about Carter's death. She insisted that despite her concerns, she never wished him harm and was heartbroken over his murder. Her raw emotions struck the detectives, but they remained focused, probing for any signs that Lisa might have been more involved than she was letting on. By the end of the interrogation, Lisa's alibi seemed solid, but her deep concern over Carter's relationships couldn't be ignored. Colley and Keller left the interview with a clearer picture of Lisa's frustrations and her complicated feelings toward Carter. Though she was upset, the detectives still had to consider the possibility that Lisa's worries had escalated into something more dangerous. On July 20, 2017, 5 days after Carter Dressler's body was found, the Richmond Police Department received a critical piece of new evidence that would change the direction of the investigation. It was a hot, humid afternoon with temperatures soaring into the mid-90s, typical for a Virginia summer. Detective Laura Colley was at her desk going over notes from previous interviews when a forensic technician entered the office with a report in hand. The technician, Mike Harris, handed Colley the report with this serious expression. "You're going to want to see this," he said. The report detailed the results of the toxicology tests performed on the tea found at Carter's home. The tests confirmed that the tea had been laced with aconite, a rare and highly toxic plant also known as monk's wood, which was found growing in Carter's garden. Aconite is notoriously difficult to detect, and its effects can be mistaken for natural causes unless specifically tested for. Colley quickly called her partner, Tom Keller, and they reviewed the findings together. The presence of aconite confirmed their suspicions that Carter's death was not an accident. More importantly, it pointed directly to someone who had knowledge of plants and access to Carter's garden. This led the detectives to revisit their list of suspects, particularly focusing on those who had been close to Carter and might have known about the deadly properties of aconite. The detectives decided to search Carter's home again, this time with a more focused approach. They combed through his belongings, looking for anything that might suggest someone had been tampering with his garden or his food. In the process, they discovered a small locked box hidden in Carter's bedroom closet. Inside, they found a collection of sexually explicit letters and notes from his students, most of which were from Dan White. The letters were graphic and intensely personal, confirming a secret consensual sexual relationship between Carter and Dan that had become increasingly strained in recent weeks. The tone of the letters suggested that Dan had grown more possessive and jealous, often expressing anger and frustration over Carter's possible sexual relationships with other boys. One letter, in particular, stood out. It was dated just a few days before Carter's death and hinted at a possible breakup. Dan wrote about feeling abandoned and betrayed, stating, "If you're gonna bleep some other hot young thing, I don't want you alive." This discovery shifted the investigation's focus sharply back to Dan White. The new evidence not only confirmed a motive but also placed Dan at the center of the investigation. Colley and Keller knew they needed to bring Dan back in for questioning, this time with the new evidence in hand. The stage was set for a final confrontation, and the detectives were determined to uncover the truth. Hey, true crime case solvers interested in more real-life murder mysteries, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. And do you have any thoughts about this case or have a case of your own you'd like us to investigate? Leave us a comment. Stay safe, true crime case solvers. With the new evidence pointing strongly toward Dan White, the detectives decided to investigate one final suspect, Officer Charlie Brennan, a 47-year-old Richmond police officer. Brennan lived across the street from Carter Dressler and was initially in charge of the investigation before being removed due to his personal connection to the victim. Brennan was known for his no-nonsense attitude and strong sense of justice, but it was his secret sexual relationship with Carter that now made him a person of interest. Detectives Laura Colley and Tom Keller approached Brennan carefully. Given his position within the police force, they knew they had to tread lightly. They requested to speak with Brennan at his home, a modest brick house on a quiet, tree-lined street. When they arrived, Brennan greeted them with a stoic expression, clearly aware that the investigation was closing in on him. The detectives began by asking Brennan about his relationship with Carter. Brennan admitted that they had become close over the years, initially bonding over their shared interest in history. What began as casual conversations about Civil War battles and local Richmond history soon deepened into a series of secret sexual liaisons. Brennan spoke of Carter with a mix of fondness and regret, acknowledging that their relationship had to be kept hidden due to the potential scandal it could cause. When Colley asked Brennan if he had ever suspected anyone of wanting to harm Carter, he hesitated. Brennan admitted that he had been worried about Carter's habit of sleeping with his male students for quite some time, ever since Carter offered to share some of his boy bank with Brennan. He had also noticed Dan White's increasingly possessive behavior and had even warned Carter to be cautious. Brennan's paternal instincts towards Carter were strong, and he confessed that he had grown suspicious of Dan's intentions, particularly in the weeks leading up to Carter's death. Colley and Keller then shifted the conversation to the night of Carter's murder. Brennan stated that he had been at home, working late on some case files. He claimed he had no idea Carter was in danger and was devastated when he learned of his death. However, Colley noted a subtle change in Brennan's demeanor when they mentioned the aconite found in Carter's tea. Brennan's face tightened, and his answers became more clipped, as if he was carefully choosing his words. Despite his composed exterior, the detectives could sense Brennan's unease. They asked if he had ever handled aconite or knew of its deadly properties. Brennan responded that he was familiar with the plant, having learned about it during the case years ago, but insisted he had never used it. However, the tension in the room was palpable, and Colley and Keller couldn't shake the feeling that Brennan was hiding something. As the interview concluded, the detectives were left with more questions than answers. Brennan's connection to Carter and his knowledge of aconite made him a viable suspect, but without concrete evidence, they couldn't make an arrest. However, his behavior during the interview only deepened their suspicion, and they knew they couldn't rule him out just yet. On July 22, 2017, Richmond detectives Laura Colley and Tom Keller finally identified the person responsible for Carter Dressler's death. The investigation had been intense, with multiple suspects and conflicting evidence. But the new information from Carter's letters, combined with forensic evidence, led them to one clear conclusion. Dan White, Carter's 18-year-old student, neighbor, and sexual partner, was the murderer. Dan had been involved in a secret sexual relationship with Carter for over a year. While the relationship was consensual and full of intense passions, it became increasingly toxic as Dan grew more possessive and controlling. The letters found in Carter's lockbox revealed Dan's escalating jealousy and fear of losing Carter to, quote, hotter boys. The final letter, written just days before Carter's death, hinted at a potential breakup, which Dan couldn't accept. It was clear that Dan's obsessive love had turned deadly. The detectives knew they had to act quickly to prevent Dan from fleeing. On the afternoon of July 22, they arrived at Dan's home with an arrest warrant. It was a hot, sunny day with temperatures hovering around 95 degrees. Dan was at home alone, watching an adult movie on his laptop when the detectives knocked on his door. Colley and Keller calmly informed Dan of the charges against him, murder in the first degree. Dan's reaction was one of shock. He stood frozen in the doorway, his face pale and his eyes wide. He stammered out a denial, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. As the detectives handcuffed Dan and led him to the police car, he began to cry. His tears quickly turned to anger as he realized the gravity of his situation. He yelled at the detectives, accusing them of ruining his life, and insisting that he had only wanted to protect Carter from, quote, the horrors of life and love. But his words fell on deaf ears. The detectives had heard similar stories before. The evidence was clear. Dan had used aconite from Carter's garden to poison him, slipping it into his tea during one of their evening meetings. Back at the police station, Dan's confession was recorded. He admitted to poisoning Carter but claimed it was an act of love. He said he couldn't bear the thought of losing Carter to someone else and believed that death was the only way to keep him forever. Dan's twisted sense of love and control had driven him to commit murder. The news sent ripples through the community, where Carter had been a respected teacher and neighbor. The arrest brought a sense of closure, but it also left many unanswered questions about the nature of the relationship between Carter and Dan and how it had gone so tragically wrong. Dan White's trial for the murder of Carter Dressler began on August 7, 2017 in the Richmond Circuit Court. The case drew considerable media attention, with local news outlets covering every development. The courtroom was packed with spectators, including Carter's family and friends, all eager to see justice served. The prosecution was led by Assistant Commonwealth Attorney Rebecca Owens, a 45-year-old lawyer known for her dedication and sharp legal mind. Owens presented a compelling case against Dan. She highlighted the evidence, including the letters from Carter's lockbox and the toxicology report confirming the presence of aconite in Carter's tea. Owens argued that Dan's obsession and jealousy were the driving forces behind the murder. She described how Dan had poisoned Carter in a final act of control and rage, emphasizing the premeditated nature of the crime. In his defense, Dan was represented by Desmond J. Carter, a 42-year-old attorney with a reputation for handling difficult cases. Carter argued that Dan had not intended to kill Carter, but was driven to a breaking point by emotional turmoil. He portrayed Dan as a troubled young man who had acted out of a distorted sense of love. The defense's strategy was to mitigate Dan's responsibility, suggesting that his actions were the result of an emotional breakdown rather than cold-blooded murder. Throughout the trial, Carter's family sat in the front row, their faces a mix of grief and disbelief. They listened as the details of Carter's relationship with Dan were laid bare. Emotions ran high as Carter's family members took the stand, describing the impact of his death on their lives and the community. Their testimony painted a picture of Carter as a kind and dedicated teacher who was deeply loved and respected. On August 15, 2017, after a week of intense arguments and emotional testimony, the jury returned with a verdict. Dan White was found guilty of first-degree murder. The decision came as a relief to Carter's family, who had been waiting for this moment with bated breath. During sentencing on August 22, Dan was given a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The judge, noting the premeditated nature of the crime and the suffering inflicted on Carter's family, felt this sentence was appropriate. The courtroom was filled with a sense of grim satisfaction. While the sentence could never bring Carter back, it provided a measure of justice and closure for those he left behind. The trial had a profound effect on the community. Richmond was shaken by the revelation of the secret relationship and the murder that followed. Carter's students and neighbors mourned the loss of a beloved figure while grappling with the shock of the crime. The case served as a stark reminder of the dark side of human relationships and the devastating consequences of unchecked jealousy and obsession. After Dan White's sentencing on August 22, 2017, the community of Richmond began to pick up the pieces from the shocking events. The trial had left a lasting impact on everyone involved, from Carter Dressler's family to his students and the local community. Dan White's life, on the other hand, took a drastic turn. He was transferred to a maximum security prison in Virginia. There, he faced a difficult reality. While he was in protective custody due to the high-profile nature of his case, life behind bars was harsh. Dan's family struggled to cope with the fallout from the trial. His parents, who had been supportive throughout the proceedings, found themselves under intense scrutiny from the media and community. They moved away from Richmond to avoid the constant attention and to try and rebuild their lives away from the public eye. In the years following the trial, the case of Carter Dressler remained a topic of discussion in Richmond. It served as a sobering reminder of how deeply personal relationships can impact lives and how unchecked emotions can lead to tragic outcomes. The community continued to honor Carter's memory, ensuring that his story would be remembered not only for the tragedy but also for the positive impact he had on those around him.